Mondian Astral Oracles, dearly beloved, thank you for being with me, interacting with the content, and joining in on this journey towards the stars. We're going to talk about Ascension here. Um, well, the idea is, of course, as if you've been keeping up with the content, that we are essentially thoughts within a type of mind of God, subdivisions within a type of divine body. This is a way to conceptualize the multiverse, that it is a weird unity made up of separate parts that kind of feed into the separate organism that makes up a sustainable whole. So that's the image of the body, and within that there are these, let's say, greater and greater subdivisions of dimensions. And the further you move, let's say, down in the dimensions, I actually prefer the idea of the mandala. So the first dimension is the outward layer, and the further in you get, the closer to the core you get, where everything is completely interconnected all the time. But in these outer shells, outer layers, where consciousness resides, it's it's bound up in more separate structures. So the idea is, we're also finding in physics, right, is that we actually have a very, very hard time of understanding what form and shape is, because it seems to be um, mental constructs, fields that are conceptualized as solids. And it's out in these solid spheres, the first dimensions, 1, 2, 3 in particular, the physical spheres, that the separation is the greatest. What then happens as consciousness activates, it reaches a greater degree of interconnection, we could say. So it begins to connect and understand the first three dimensions through a fourth dimension. Um, and the fourth dimension is time. And so, what is happening in this tiny part of the multiverse we call planet Earth, and in this subset of time, and on the surface level of the continents, where we are, we hominids, we humans, is that we are acting as an extension of the universe in understanding and conceptualizing the three dimensions into a fourth dimension. So we're sort of moving consciousness into a layer of integration and understanding here. And we have been doing this for quite some time. So the process we know as history is the process of integrating this um, disparate, let's say, objectified reality into something that's more connected, sequential, understood to be cause and effect, for instance. So this is the logic of time. What's then going on in the fifth dimension? The fifth dimension is connected then to a layer of time that's above it. So it's stepping above then another dimension and viewing that from a higher degree. So the tentative concepts we have around this are things such as the ether, the akashic, and synchronicity. So it's the idea that there are certain codes that we will often experience in symbols, certain patterning, certain energy resonances that move beyond time and space, um, that actually correspond in very deep and meaningful ways, in the way that consciousness is experiencing and orchestrating the world. Hope you're keeping up here. I know it's difficult. Um, so consciousness is essentially more an interplay of deep integrated connections, rather than it's something that's, let's say, located in physical space, and then is like a 3D creature that's then animated and keeping up with time and memory and future and prognostics, like 4D experience, us as historical beings, we become more his, historic, symbolic energy beings. So beings that are existing in deep patterned relationships across time and space. And this is something that you discover in synchronicity, as in synchronicity increases in your life, that there needs to be these deep layered orchestrations. And something I've been experiencing lately, for instance, is going to churchyards to get water and power and such, out camping. I find that I will glimpse like numerologies on the different tombstones there, uh, that appeal to me in very, very meaningful ways. And then, the deep orchestration of reality, where somebody had to live their entire life to die at this time, be played out there, and then I'm somehow brought in later in time space, it seems, to experience something that's subjectively meaningful to me in correspondence to that, which is then again layered back to even like deeper layers of semantic codes, and where it completely baffles the mind to a degree where you can't keep up with it in sequential understanding. It's so intuitive, so emotional, these deep layers of synchronistic meaning, and it is really meaning as the signature of meaning that you begin to register it with. So the 5D has like a much higher degree of fulfillment in existing. You feel it through a higher degree of meaning, of love, of well-being, we can sense. But it's not, as someone asked me here, it's not that the ascension is from 4D to 5D is, what we think of as the apocalypse. Like, this is a very erroneous idea that there's a switch all of a sudden going on, and then it goes from one state of being to another state of being. This happens in death and stuff, but essentially this is not happening, because notice how much we detest this happening as human conscious beings. Like, one of the worst things that can happen to our mind is uh, like the suspension of belief through dramatic intervention. What do I mean by that? It's essentially that there needs to be a moment of plausibility, organic growth in the way we develop, because we are coming out of the dimension of time. So we need to experience ourselves moving from one connected sense of circumstances to another. And these intense time life shifts, where everything were to just shift from one point to another, let's say from this material state to a very dreamlike state, the mind would simply not be able to follow that. And that's why miracles are so extreme to us, because we'd love to see it, and at the same time it is exactly unbelievable to us that things can just switch like that. So we need to have this progress of growing into a higher dimensional experience. Um, and notice again, think of the world as a type of narrative structure. Um, like, this is the absolute worst forms of storytelling to the human mind, are stories where everything is just solved one, two, three, like the DSS ex machina, it's sometimes called. You'll wind up an intrigue, and then you'll just introduce literally a god it used to be. They'll come on stage and then solve everything. This is terrible, terrible storytelling. And as Aristotle taught us in Poetics, you need to have this element of plausibility, of recognizability, that things seem like they are developing in a recognizable way. And this is what makes a good experience happen. So essentially, for us to have a good ascension experience, we need to have this experience of overcoming, being faced with crisis, cul-de-sacs, dead ends, weird mysteries that are somehow resolved and brought into to unity, to greater states of union. Okay, so how do we express states of union? Well, the most eloquently we could say we express union in symbols. And notice what are the most powerful symbols are usually religious symbols. These are symbols that unify opposites within them. And so, speaking of Christ consciousness, let's take the cross here, because the cross is an intersection of the two, the vertical and the horizontal axis. And sorry for doing the opposite thing, confusing, right? So the vertical and the horizontal thing, these two axes are intersected into the human heart. And what happens is it breaks the time space by this intersection. So, what is actually happening with the cross? Well, it's compounding an entire narrative of what the world looks like, what humanity looks like. Well, the story of the Gospels. Um, you know all that thing, John 3:16, I believe you know it, that God gave His Son to the world to redeem it somehow. This is all compounded in the cross. But what does this actually look like from the perspective of Christ consciousness? Well, as we move out of time, what does Christ consciousness appears to us at? This is one of the stories that keep mirroring itself and the time it exists in different ways. So the story of incarnation and Jesus and all that stuff will look different from every age that's perceiving it. And what we can discern now is, notice that if you are, let's say, a divine being, a union of the divine principle with the human principle, which is essentially, completely essential Christian Trinitarian doctrine, that Jesus is completely divine and completely human. This means that he actually exists beyond time. And so, if he exists beyond time, that means that he chooses from a point of conscious effort to move into time, simulating himself as a human being to essentially reconfigure the time space in a symbolic way that then breaks up the entire human narrative into a different way or a different trajectory of understanding. So you can sort of see um, Jesus the Christ as a principle that hacks into time to realign and reconfigure it, to restructure history itself. And this is why it's known in its final form, right, as the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. It's the human principle that reaches its full circle and then moves into the cross section in the exact densest point of history and geography, where the three continents collide in that crazy place we call the Holy Land that really sees some incredible weird developments in history. And there it compounds itself and then emanates into history in weird ways, reconfiguring awakenings with all these negative and positive consequences that are sort of related to the trajectory of the Christ coming into history. And this is Christ consciousness. This is the element of perfected human consciousness that stands without time and then is able to move into time and regulate it. And to contrast this with, let's say, more Buddha like states of consciousness. Here I'm, of course, playing around with figures. I don't know how these historical figures actually experience reality, right? But like, to contrast this idea of being, let's say, the time hacker, the magician, this elevated state of Christ consciousness that moves in, of human consciousness that moves in to redeem the human spirit, to try to guide it into a realization at the end of time. To contrast it with more of a bodhisattva experience or a Buddha experience. The Buddha experience, I believe, is sometimes also described in one of the texts as um, the quaking of the 10,000 kalpas. So the world images, it's essentially stepping beyond the breaking the illusion. And so instead of reconfiguring the diamond of time, the prism of time, by moving into it, it instead distances itself. It instead becomes the very framework or the annulment of time itself. This is another state of human redemption that's also that can be strived for and attained. And of course, discerning these qualities, it's only because if you like to play around with these categories, and somebody has been asking me about these things, it can be very helpful to see that the Christ consciousness is that which works in time, and the Buddha consciousness is that which steps beyond the illusion of time as such. So these are different ways of thinking about it. Well, then notice, how does this work in the ascension we're experiencing, 5D ascension? Well, as we move into this organic development of growing consciousness, of us becoming light beings, light bodies, realizing our true nature as infinite light, as the uh, emanation creation of everything, as source itself. We do this gradually by becoming more and more of our light bodies. And this means that we become less and less entangled to physical space as hard permeable objects. So notice what happens after the crucifixion. I was very puzzled when I actually read the Gospels, because it's not something people usually talk about. But notice that there are these weird passages of the changed Christ body. So they're unable to recognize him. He comes back, and somehow he's able to reveal his essence as the Christ to people when he wants to, but he looks different. He is different somehow. And so this is the idea that in 5D consciousness, as we move into it, well, our physical bodies will become more permeable, mutable. They will begin to look different depending on our configurations of energy and mind, for instance. We will also experience longer and longer longevity as the medium of time begins to melt and dissolve. But time will still be a factor as long as we have bodies, which we have in 5, 6, and 7D consciousness. These bodies appear more and more as more, let's say, prismatic rainbow arrangements of light as you move up the dimensional ladder. In the 5D consciousness or 5D ascension experiences, we move into a state of reality that's more 5D. Things that will also happen will also be classical, let's say, magical powers, not only thaumaturgy, manifestation, making things happen, but also things such as levitation, teleportation, telekinesis. Teleportation is one of the very late stages, and that then begins to herald the movement into six-dimensional consciousness. But notice again, then, when you are able to teleport, you are essentially moving into a space where time no longer exists. And then that means that when you move into six-dimensional consciousness, just to give you a taste of this, then you begin to experience all the alternate versions of yourself at the same time, so you can choose all the timelines very, very consciously. But that won't be in at least another 100 years, and when we're using years like this, then passages of the Earth around the Sun, because time really is changing. And notice what's happening to so many of us as we move through these very powerful portals of 888 to the full moon in Aquarius here, the 11th August, was really that we shifted into this way more empowered state. So the frequency of light that many people have had a trouble, that light worker configurations have had a trouble holding, and have very much been escaping from this reality. It's gradually shifting, or it's not gradually, it has now shifted into a tipping point which it gradually, of course, moved to, where we are now experiencing an empowerment of this light within the world. So the configurations of our physical world will be conducive to this light moving through it. And that's why you may be experiencing yourself as people. I've had the joy of sharing people um, who I'd say have probably struggled somehow with meekness, like putting their light under a bushel, being someone pe- who felt called to serve in other ways, are reporting back to me that they're experiencing like a sense of empowerment and no nonsense mentality, that's baffling to them. But that's definitely very, very helpful, both to their lives and to their surroundings. And so I hope you feel this growing light progressing in your own life, because the time really is now. So this 5D consciousness you will be experiencing, notice that then some of the early symptoms is like early manifestation, the quick ability to see this patterning being reiterated, the ability to heal up mentally, to recompose yourself quickly after a lot of, let's say, dramatic events of some quality or another. And these might very well be very surprising to the very, let's say, emotional human beings that I have the good turn of communicating with in this practice. So thank you for being on the path, and for holding the light, and for carrying this your torch in the world, because it is truly something where we're all, when it gets a little stormy outside or something, we are lending each other that flame that we hold in our heart, right? And for the people where they're walking around and it's extinguished, well, more and more of that is kind of becoming a light. So the heart space is opening by us sort of, extending our candles, our torches to each other, and then hopefully we can begin to glow up the planet, and save all this the mess before it's too late, and create a world where there's room for all life, right? And explore the skies together. So much love to you out there. And if you're still watching, just practical announcements. This is August, and I plan to bring some live streams and new things to you sooner, or return to some of the communal gatherings. So I'm looking forward to that, and I think one will be with the Sophia Dragon Tribe later in August. I hope to set that up. So much love to you out there, and I hope this finds you well.